Cool. Yeah.
I'll give that a thumbs up.
Yeah. 2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up.
Yeah. Do you think if it was less than 2 thumbs up, would you have 1 thumbed up it? Or do you think like it was just the...
No, I think if I had both hands available, I would 2 thumbs up it. And if I had like another hand, on a filter or on down my pants, I would just give it 1 thumbs up.
Yeah. There is the thumbs up is just an overall gesture. With you will get it with whatever you have available.
Yeah, it was definitely not a Siskel and Roper. Gradient.
Yeah. It's super to open really tangential. I was some buddies in New York the other day, and one of them was saying that we were comparing the differences between the rude hand gestures from the UK and the US, which are slightly different. And she was saying that when she's in traffic, one of the things that she likes doing is she gives people a thumbs down. And I thought that was like really constructive, like as opposed to just it's like what you're doing is not good.
Yeah,
you should change what you're doing.
Yeah, it's more feedback than most people get.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that occurred to me here is, like, I was curious of your relationship to pattern, Because there were some moments here where we both had, I guess we were in little niches of systems and things that were going, and we had these asynchronous, chaotic, rhythmic patterns that were happening.
Sure, I think that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of people would say that, that pattern is sort of like, that is sort of music.
Yeah.
And I guess that like a rhythm, like a rhythm is sort of, if you sped it up, it would be legit like a tone, and then especially like in a synthesizer, I mean, if you have a tone and you turn it down, it does become like, popping and that sort of thing. So I guess that if like rhythm is the sort of like a basis for music, it's like, it's by definition like a tone. And then if you had like a chord, and if you had like a just intonation chord and you tuned it down, it would be like a funky rhythm.
Yeah, like some kind of polyrhythm thing.
Yeah. So I guess that my relationship to it is that I think that like when I'm improvising, it's got to be, that anything. I mean, anything should be allowed. And so I'm always rhythmic because I grew up playing rock music and jazz, and then like when I was a teenager, I went to dance clubs and I heard like Baltimore club music and Chicago like acid house and stuff when I was in the early 90s. So I'm always into it really. I'm really into rhythm, but it's totally unnecessary. So if like I was playing with somebody and it felt like that wasn't that wasn't necessary or it wasn't happening, then I wouldn't pursue it.
Yeah.
I'd like listen for it and see if it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Or if it's working. It's similarly to harmony, because I have the ability to completely harmonize. I have to do it by ear because I don't have a quantizer, or I don't have I obviously don't have like fixed pitches or notes or anything available to me, but I do have a continuum of frequency, and I can easily tune if I hear something interesting. And so I was working with these students who were improvising the other day, and one of the students sincerely asked me, like, is it okay if I like play notes and harmonies? And I was like, yes, yes, because that's improvisation, and you have to like just bring you have to just bring yourself to the table and like what you're into. I was thinking more like my advice to her was more like, just be open-minded if the stuff going around you isn't like isn't quite like gelling with it, because if you're doing something that it resembles a lot more of like some kind of traditional music, but the other stuff that's happening isn't, that could actually be really exciting to listen to or be really exciting for the audience, that kind of tension. And so I just think, like there should, there's no rules about like what's going to work.
Yeah. I mean, with that, there's an interesting one, like in running like an improv night for a bunch of years, where someone would show up and not know that it was, let's say, like a free improv type thing situation. They might show up and start playing something in the key, and it would inevitably, even in a context where things were open, it would magnetize stuff where I found, and I don't know if this is different in your experience, that in a context where there's not an expectation, the moment that something normative happens, it tends to like almost automatically otherize other things. So if, let's say, like there were three people playing and one of them starts playing chords, it automatically made the other things weird sounds on chords in a way that would be separate if any other behavior happened, in that like the normative just automatically established its defaultness, which was always interesting here, and particularly in a context like this where there's electronic stuff, and even your example before, like that you have a continuous pitch, and I guess as a conscious decision you don't have quantizers because you presumably could. We could be, there's definitely not that happening here, but if there was a tonal thing, you could relate to it, you could go to it, you could go to some interval relations to it, or you could just not acknowledge it. Like obviously if you're making frequencies and there could be pitched material coming from you, but if you don't engage in what the expectation of established like Western music would be, if you don't play notes, they're not notes, even though they're like they're still notes.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like, I think that if so we have an improv festival here in Baltimore, and we've been doing it. We're in our like 27th year this year or something, and and it's like 4 days of it, and it's like 4 hours a night, and I've gone to every single one. So I've heard a lot of this stuff where it's a lot of people who've never played together, and I've been hearing that for now half my life.
Yeah.
I've been hearing more than half my life, I think. And so I'm kind of into this thing where I had this experience where, sometimes it's like a good portion of the night will feel like it's like really, like scratchy, like texture and, shrieking, and then at a certain point in the evening, it like 10 minutes into the third set, it would be like all of a sudden there's like a perfectly tuned chord.
Yeah.
Somehow, like a singer and a violin player and even like an electronic drone, and everything's all of a sudden it's just, and sometimes it's like, it's almost like you can hear like the breath like just fall, like everybody's like, like loses their breath for a second. And a lot of times at the end of those sets, sometimes it's like, woo, like it's like this like thunderous applause, because it just kind of feels like, it almost feels like that there's like, it's almost like, like Ice 9 from the Kurt Vonnegut novel. It's almost like all the gelatin, all the gelatin settles all of a sudden, and the whole room fills up with, it's like a big ball of Jello.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not that I like or love that or anything. It's just that it's just a reminder that we can go anywhere, or we can do anything with this music.
Yeah, which I mean is sort of where my initial question was coming around pattern, that the rhythmic, co-rhythmic, it wasn't a groove, but like there was a thing that established that is novel in the other language that we're developing, and we just arrived at this rhythmic space. And we had some other stuff later on where we were both doing like kind of high melodic things, so we had a couple of these novel moments in the context of noisy synth stuff that can stand out, in like enough for me to follow up with specifically a question about that interesting like the patterny rhythmic-y things that we had going on.
Yeah, I love that. I guess that I just want to, I just think I had a moment like maybe like 8 or 9 years ago where I was just thinking that, it just occurred to me that I improvise more than anything else, like when I'm playing. And then I even had I even have this band that I do in Baltimore called Leprechaun Catering.
That's a good name.
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of compliments on that name over the years. Actually, the owner of this store came up with that.
Wow.
Yeah. Because I used to cook and cater all the time for people.
Right.
and he just called me one day. He's like a poet and everything, so he called me and he was like, "This is an inquiry for Leprechaun Catering." Like he like named my catering company, and that ended up being the name of the band.
Right.
But even with him, we don't have songs. But of course, we play together so much, and we used to have samplers and everything. So a lot of times we would even have a master tempo and stuff. So it's not like it wasn't like free improvisation, but we just didn't have any songs. And so I've done that more than anything. And it occurred to me like 8 or 9 years ago that that I was like, well, my history or my past is like, is sort of like art punk, and then when I was a kid, singing in church choir, and and it's just like all these things, and I was like, I'm not, even though I grew up playing piano or playing jazz guitar, and then I've been doing this for over 20 years. It's like I think all those things have to be. I have to be doing that still. Like I'm still playing guitar. Somehow I'm still sitting at a piano or whatever. And so I just had this. It sounds too simplistic for me to call it an awakening, but it was kind of like an awakening because I was like, when I'm improvising with somebody, I just have to be myself. And so if I repeat phrases or if I do things that recall musicality or if I play a riff, that even though it's on the synthesizer, that to me in my mind I'm playing like AC/DC or whatever, that it's like that's just what the moment is, or that I'm just being myself or whatever.
Yeah,
and that sounds simplistic, but
no, I agree. I mean, there's like a kind of like a post-genre, like it's not ironic use of that, but it's like a reflective use of that that I think is. I mean, I think most people who improvise have typically quite varied backgrounds in what they do. So to completely ignore things like that can also be an overly, not extreme, but
it's a bit reactionary.
Yeah, exactly, and that can in and of itself like limit the overall expression of what could be possible.
Sure.
And that's not to say that everything needs to be like that Zorn-like pastiche of mushing up genres, which is an approach. But I think having that in an acknowledged reality of your musical language and self that can manifest in a typical context for it, I think can be useful, because otherwise, like if it is just reactionary, if it's just bound by the limitations of like we are specifically not doing that, then you're in effect doing that, but just the other side of it,
Well, it's sort of like like in literary theory, how they say like that you're this sort of like you're like this, you have this sort of like meta text, and that everybody has like their own sort of text, and that so sort of like when you go to write or when you write poetry or whatever, that you sort of have like it's sort of like having like the English language, but your own version of it that's literature, and so I think that music's like that, and so in a way it's not like a postmodern pastiche, because in a postmodern pastiche it's very like contrived, whereas I think that if you're just like a human being and like a player, it's going to be, you're not going to understand all those connections. It's sort of like with synesthesia, how in synesthesia, it's like your mind will map like cinnamon to like a tetrahedron, and that's like, it's like you experience, you might experience that, especially like after the fact. You'll be like, oh, the other day I was on mushrooms, or or you were just had a synesthesia fit while you were like cooking or whatever. But it's like you don't understand why that connection was made. It's just the way that it's just the way you build. You're built. It's just the way that the sort of Legos are put together. It's too complex for you to understand, and I think that music must be like that.
For sure, and our like conception of it, and then what we then choose to do. To maybe ask like a perhaps unanswerable question, you as someone reading something or listening to something, like is there a difference between the like pastiche or the postmodern pastiche thing or the earnest expression? Like does that manifest differently in a way that you can tell, and or do you care? Separate
Yeah.
from like your aesthetic reading.
Yeah,
of it.
I mean, this is like a, definitely like like an academic point, but I do think, I mean, maybe there isn't a difference, because maybe, maybe that's what, or maybe that's what's different about postmodernism and modernism is that like when when if you grew up post 1960 with television or whatever, that you're going to pastiche a lot more because you just have more media. Like instead of just a newspaper, now you have newspaper and like commercials and like movies and TV shows and news and cop shows and like so all the things, and so you become more pastiche because of how much like how mediated your brain experiences. Yeah. But I do think though that and so what we're talking about is kind of like that. Because my dad was a classical musician, but he played in a cover band, and and I grew up with metal, and then jazz, and then what blah blah blah. But let me make sure I don't fall off topic here. I think though that there is a thing though there is a thing that happens nowadays where it's like, I got a chance. This is going to be my first Netflix show, and it's going to be like a postmodern Western. There is this like really contrived thing that people do. Where it almost becomes, like a blurb or something where it's really where it's more like discourse where you intentionally you're intentionally being subversive and squaring a circle, to be unique or to have a certain kind of identity about something that you're doing. It's almost like it's sort of like a way of, I think, a way of doing composition that could be screenwriting or musical composition or whatever, where you're like intentionally, intentionally like putting things in there in almost like a witty, like in a witty way, and sort of like bricolage. I think of bricolage in this as being like a very intentionally, like this block, you don't just throw any block there. You put this block there, and then you put that block on top of that, and that's like, that's a more contrived thing where you're intellectually taking a little bit of time to make a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, even hearing you talk about it, like it was just a kind of a half question because like it's one like there's not really a clear, it's a complex thing, but in hearing you talk about it, relating it to specifically media or like TV or shows or movies or things like this, where I think some of that can, at least for me, feels a lot more legible, and I do wonder how much of that is because language is involved and language is a little bit more flattenable than music. Obviously, like language is complex and all that as well, but things do seem more. Can for me seem more obvious or contrived or like that's a bit much when there's language involved or specifically TV or media things like, in a way that when music, like if you were to all of a sudden in the middle there'd like a sax solo would come out of your thing, I wouldn't know how to interpret that on that level, whereas like if we're having a conversation now, you slip in like a joke or something like that in like a very obvious way that would read more.
Sure,
way,
sure. And in this context, if I like made some reference to like Midsummer Night's Dream or something, people would just be like, "Oh, that's just a cool part of their conversation," even though it's like it's a much more of a signifier than like a musical gesture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and I think I do often wonder if language is the vehicle that can make that clearer, but I don't know because music is inherently abstract. At least wordless music is inherently abstracted. Like there's no meaning in these sounds.
Right. That's kind of what I was saying of like, to me as AC/DC, because, somebody hearing that back or like me doing AC/DC on like a modular synthesizer with no fixed pitches, somebody's not, a lot of people aren't going to pick up on that.
Yeah. Did you do AC/DC in the first one?
Not this one.
Okay,
no.
yeah.
Like no, I don't contrive. I don't bring it. I'm not trying to pull a fast one on you, but, I guess though that I guess what I was thinking more about this, like, experience that I had where I just kind of settled into this is I think that when I was in my 30s or even a little bit younger, and I was like coming into the scene, there was such we all were reactionary, and everybody was reactionary, and it was almost like, you know, when you would sit down at an instrument, you did have to be kind of extreme. You know, it's sort of like in the 90s when, you know, in here we had a lot of shows in here in the 90s that were improv shows, and they were improv, except that a lot of it was this lowercase movement, you know, where people were playing it really, really restrained. And it was like very, very restrained. And then you had a few players who were from, you know, an earlier era, like the 70s and 80s, that were mixing with this like late 90s kind of style. And then they started changing their playing a bit, you know? And so you had like people who would play, you know, much more gesturally and emotively were starting to like pull back their playing, and all the volume was kind of lowering and everything. And, you know, it's like, it's sort of, you know, and then there would be some other extreme, like, cause like 10 years after that, or like even less, like even 7 or 8 years after that, it was almost like harsh noise, you know, like the opposite. It was like super loud, and a lot of times like you know, that was similar in a way that a lot of times the gesture was gone, or there wasn't a lot of gesture in it. But it just, you know, I think that people are more, you know, specific about like their playing style, and they do certain things. I think that a lot of people do cut off, you know, their history, and they do cut off certain parts of who they are, so they can focus in on certain kind of things. And I think. And I don't, like, again, I don't know if I'm being, you know, I don't know if I'm even being honest with myself when I say this, but at least ideally, like, I can tell you honestly, my ideal would be that I don't do that.
Yeah.
That, you know, my ideal is that I would be not that I would be 100% completely open to playing in any, you know, in with any possibility, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you in that, but at the same time, I acknowledge the fact that, like, as a human being alive, you know, with a brain full of languages and stuff like this, like, as much as like what we're doing here is expression, and we don't understand what's happening, and that's the beauty of improv and all that kind of stuff. We are bags of meat that are like pulling along our history, just our time, like just sort of floating as like this kind of gelatinous back, like secretions behind us that are part of what we do now. So it is, I very much like that gesture of I am doing this, but at the same time aware that like I am now using words that I did not invent, you know, and like we are sitting here in a room that someone built, like it is endless, that is like humanity, like we exist as the tips of a long line of stuff. But I think acknowledging what we find to be ideal, I think is a nice idea there. And I think we're both in concert in terms of what we find valuable, that we're not sitting here and necessarily exploring or manifesting it is a history and a tradition, but not we're not manifesting a history and tradition of duo synthesizer, you know, kind of thing. Like we're trying to do something where we're doing something new, but you know, so that like it's the angle where that line is pointed is I think we're in pointing in the same direction.
Yeah, well, there was a musician this year at the High Zero Festival. I'm not mentioning any names, but there was a musician here at the High Zero Festival this year that was quite controversial. Oh, and part of the nature of the controversy was that, you know, that it was almost like this sort of playing was like, you know, very conventional at times. And it reminded me of how I've had this experience over the years, you know, at this festival, because it's just a lot of like, you know, it's not like a good improvised band like me and my Leprechaun catering partner, you know, where we have like an established repertoire. If we went to a festival, they would get what they would expect because somebody there knows us and knows what we're going to do. And this is a lot more risky or like unpredictable. And I've had people tell me over the years, like, you know, like that, you know, I was like, I could see your body language after that set. You looked like you didn't like it, you know. And I've had people be like, well, it wasn't the music that I wanted to do, you know. And it's always bothered me. Even though I know that I could be that person, like I know that I could be that person who was like, I you know, I'm really disappointed in that, and I know that really sucked, and that wasn't my fault or whatever, you know. And I think that this year there was someone who just really like no one knew how to play with this person,
Right.
and no one could figure it out. And I think that it makes the set into the music you don't want. Like the set
Right.
ends up being like, this is the music that I don't want to be doing. And I guess that what I mean about my ideals, I don't want to be that person. Like I want to be the person who is like, okay, let's do it. Let's do it. You know, even though I'm like, you know, I'm going to play with you even with my, you know, my like non-fixed pitch, you know, like noisemaker, you know, I'm gonna play with you. That's what I wanted. That's the person I want to be.
Yeah.
On stage.
Yeah. Not in catering though. Cool. Should I play a bit more?
Sure.
Yeah. If you'd like to support the making of these videos, please join our Patreon. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.